welcome to the Global Research Network. It's lovely to see you all here. Thanks for making the time to come along and to see the wonderful Professor Tsing and to hear about her exciting project. So as you know, we are a home away from home for early career researchers and independent scholars all around the world. There are over 35 different people represented in our 35 different countries represented in our network. And we love collaborative projects, we love interdisciplinary projects. And so this is, Dr. Tsing's work is exactly the kind of thing that we're really keen to hear about. And there's been a lot of excitement and anticipation about this event. So I'll hand over to Marine, who will be saying a few words first in introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuriko. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Marine Lassier, and this is an honor for Eva Burnett-Kempers and I, both junior fellows for the think tank on animals and biodiversity at the Global Research Network, to host this event today. For those of you who might not yet be familiar with the think tank, the Animals and Biodiversity Program aims to provide meaningful insights on animal studies in an interdisciplinary perspective. You can visit our program page to know more and learn about our upcoming activities, And I invite you to join us if you're interested. Without further ado, I give the floor to Anisa Abeytia, who will introduce you to our guest of today for this book talk. I wish you all a very stimulating discussion, and I invite you to ask your questions at the end of this interview with Dr. Anna Tsing, the author of the Feral Atlas, whom I warmly thank for being with us today.
Thank you for that. So I'm Anisa Abeytia. I am the think tank program coordinator for GRN. We bring these book talks to you because as the GRN continues to grow and develop, these book talks are a way for us to further the values and missions of the GRN by sharing with you books grounded in theories and methods that echo GRN's vision. And we hope that these titles will enrich your syllabi, your literature reviews, and your research. Today we present to you the Feral Atlas. And this book, we selected this book for a number of reasons. One, because it offers a cross-disciplinary approach to understanding the complexities facing our world today. It highlights the deeper connections between humans and non-humans in creating the infrastructures that sustain and challenge our planet. And lastly, the structure of the Feral Atlas invites the reader to participate not only as a viewer, but as a co-conspirator in grappling and imagining new possibilities and solutions to some of our time's most pressing issues. Now, let me introduce Dr. Tsing. Dr. Tsing is a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She previously was a Niels Bohr professor at Aarhus University in Denmark and director of the Aarhus University research on the Anthropocene. Her current research, her past research before the Feral Atlas followed the humble trails of the mushroom in the great economic, cultural, and ecological dilemmas of our times. And the book that she wrote following that research was The Mushrooms, the End of the World, on the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. She also the author of Friction, an ethnography of global connections, and In the Realm of the Diamond Queen, Marginality, in and out of, oh, my screen just moved, in and out of the way places. And she has published all of her works through Princeton University. Now with that, I will present the first question. So the Feral Atlas is situated in the Anthropocene, in how ecologies and infrastructures are an intermingling of human and non-human entities. Dr. Tsing, could you discuss one, what is the Anthropocene? Two, why does it play a central role in the Feral Atlas? And lastly, how does the Feral Atlas define the Anthropocene?
First, thank you very much for having me in your program. I'm really honored to be here and to talk to you about the Feral Atlas, which has been a 5-year project of very hard work, not just for me, but of more than 100 collaborators, including natural scientists, social scientists, humanists, artists, map makers, software designers, and others. So it's really a pleasure to let you know about this project, which you can find online at feralatlas.org. Anthropocene is a relatively new word, but one that has already gathered a lot of different meanings. And I think this is a good thing, that sometimes we think it's terrible when words mean different things, but it has brought a lot to our discussion. It began with climate scientists who were concerned about the ways that the Earth's climate had changed due to human influence. Then it was picked up by the geologists who are still debating about whether the Anthropocene should be a geological epoch, that is, one in which humans have become a major geological force, and that you might be able to see this in the sediments, the strata of the Earth. The biologists and ecologists jumped into it, wanting to tell us about what's sometimes called the sixth extinction, the massive wave of extinctions of other species that the human presence has brought along. And then the arts, the humanities, and the social scientists got involved too. Indeed, there's no way that we could learn about the conditions under which our planetary ecologies have changed through humans without enlisting the kinds of scholars that know something about human histories, as well as those who know something about non-human histories. So Feral Atlas responds to this planetary urgency of talking about the kinds of catastrophes that that human presence on Earth through some of our projects have brought into being by trying to work across all of these disciplinary divides to bring in scientists and artists, to bring in poets and social scientists, all into the same kind of sphere, not to even out and create a single story about the planet, but in fact to show the patchiness of the Anthropocene. The term feral in Feral Atlas refers to the non-designed effects of the infrastructures that over the last 500 years have been parts of projects of imperial conquest on the one hand and industrialization on the other, that these infrastructural projects have had many kinds of effects in the way that burning fossil fuels creates all this excess carbon dioxide, which then ends up warming up the climate of the Earth, that these feral effects are, taken together, the Anthropocene, but they're patchy in particular as well as planetary. And we want to show you how you can see their particularity, their granularity, and how particular kind of toxin spreads in some areas more than others, or how an invasive species hurts the lives of particular indigenous groups more than other people who are living in that area. So we want to show the particularity of all the phenomena that go together to make up the Anthropocene, at the same time as we also want to argue that these have planetary effects. So they're both particular and planetary, and you can see how this might work through Feral Atlas.
Thank you. You mentioned patchy Anthropocene. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. We use the term patchy from coming out of the ecological use of the patch, where the patch is just an area of comparative homogeneity in a landscape full of different things. So for an ecologist, a forest might be a patch, or a lake might be a patch. In the Anthropocene, at this time of human-caused environmental kinds of phenomena, we've got new patches. Some of them are parking lots. Some of them are waste dumps. Some of them are toxic spills or the plastic gyres out in the ocean. So these are the patches that make up the Anthropocene. And so I think of that term patchy Anthropocene to remind us that the Anthropocene is made up of all these processes in which we're letting toxins escape or breeding new kinds of pathogens that are going to hurt us and our companions on Earth. So that the sum together of all these patches does create a planetary phenomenon, but we need to know it through the dynamics of particular patches.
Wonderful, thank you. And that actually leads to my next question. The environment's gone wrong is a theme that runs throughout the feral atlas. Could you explain how this happens and the role of feral qualities like capital, invasion, empire, and accelerate? And in that process, how do Anthropocene detonators and tippers factor in? And if you need me to remind you of a question, I know because once you start talking, and it's kind of a packed, loaded question there, so you can circle back around. But first, the environment's gone wrong, and that theme that runs through the feral atlas and the feral qualities.
Thank you for that question because it allows me to tell you a little bit about the structure of our thinking in putting together Feral Atlas. As I said, there's more than 100 collaborators, and most of them have written field reports about these different patchy phenomena, about what you might find in your drinking water, about whether blueberries that you might find in your freezer might be radioactive. There are many, many little field reports, all of them based on empirical investigations of some sort or another, although some from natural scientists, as I said, and some from many other kinds of methods of investigation, such as historians, indigenous elders, and others who have privileged ways of observing what's going on in making these patches of the Anthropocene. But we've also introduced a certain kind of a set of tools for thinking, which you might call analytic axes. That is, ways to bring these field reports together so they don't just sit there as singular things, but instead we offer you a way to understand them together. One of these has to do with our way of presenting the history of the Anthropocene. Now, I started off by saying that the geologists want to call it an epic. For them, an epic is a kind of planetary-wide universal classification in which you see it in the sediments of the Earth, and whether it's in North America or Tierra del Fuego, it doesn't make any difference because it's a single planetary thing. Now here, we're trying to show the patchy Anthropocene, that is, this Anthropocene that's made up of heterogeneous processes and imbued with social inequalities. How do we create that? Well, one of our ways of understanding history is through what we call Anthropocene detonators. That is, historical conjunctures that explode, if you will, that a detonation is a kind of explosion that makes history, that changes the world. And these explosions come about because of a set of programs for making certain kinds of infrastructure. And we've singled out 4 really big programs for making infrastructure that we call invasion, empire, capital, and acceleration. Now, these are historical, but they don't correspond to a single linear history. Instead, they bring together different moments of history that show these programs of infrastructure building. So our program of invasion, for example, starts 500 years ago with the European invasion of North America. But we draw into it the British occupation of Australia, which happened, of course, in the 19th century, as well as current day's invasion of the Amazon, where indigenous people are still very much living there, but are threatened by cattle ranchers and by others who want to come and take their lands away. So we've added all these invasions together, as well as the kind of everyday realities of settler colonialism in which all of us in North America live every single day. that all of these come together in the story we call invasion. And some of the kinds of technologies of invasion that give rise to these infrastructural changes are, for example, bringing whole suites of plants and animals from the homeland of the invaders to the places that are being resettled. So those plants and animals were like foot soldiers of the invasion, creating invasion themselves. So invasion brings together those technologies of replacing native ecologies and displacing native communities. In that same vein, our empire Anthropocene detonator, perhaps it begins around 1600s with the European attempts to gain a different kind of power in Asia and Africa and Latin America. That the technologies of governance that then become colonialism, European colonialism, are things like the management of water, the building of ports so that imperial European navies could get things from the colonies and bring them to the metropole. There are things like the making of plantation agriculture that then through coerced labor creates very cheap products for the metropole. So these are the kinds of infrastructural changes that we argue come together with a great explosion to change the world in a systematic way. So capital, you can imagine we're starting in the late 18th and 19th century with the kinds of industrialization that allowed the accumulation of wealth in certain kinds of elites through the commercialization of products as if they were all, of the earth as a set of natural resources for the use of particular elites. And acceleration, where we're starting that after World War II. Sometimes people call this period the Great Acceleration. And when you think environmentally, it's that time where radioactivity and toxins that are of a whole new sort than were introduced before, where we have plastics and things that just won't decay. So we have a whole new set of infrastructural changes to air, water, and land that come through each of these detonators. So those are our Anthropocene detonators, a kind of way of historicizing without using the concept of the epic or the chronology. We also talk about, so that was our first analytic access. And our second one we call tippers. So we're thinking here of the kind of systems theory that says, things are going along, but then they tip over a cliff and you can't get them back again. And social scientists and historians think about tippers, for example, the idea that feudalism gave way to capitalism. That's a tipper. But of course, ecologists use the concept of systems changes all the time to talk about the state changes that happen. For example, when a lake gets overwhelmed with so many kinds of fertilizers that fall into the lake, that it undergoes a state change. And from being a clear lake with fish and plants, it becomes a muddy lake with nothing but algae in it anymore. And it's really hard to get it back. So that's what we mean by a tipper. And we argue that some kinds of infrastructural work, that the things that these imperial and industrial infrastructures do, work as tippers. That is a kind of world-ripping change in what might be possible. So things like the speed and scale of long-distance transport across continents, which of course brought us into the COVID crisis that we're in right now, but is equally a crisis for plants and animals around the world, that we're just bringing bacteria, fungi, all kinds of pathogens back and forth across continents. So that's just one kind of tipper. While there's always been travel and trade since the beginning of humanity, what there hasn't been is the kind of scale and constancy of this long-distance intercontinental transport that we've become used to. We've naturalized it and with it, a whole slew of new pests and pathogens. So that's just one of our timbers. Another, you could say, has to do with the kind of dumping, that in the past, a, a, garbage heap was a source of great nutrition for things to grow. Things could rot and become nutrients for a whole new set of plants and animals. But now the things that we dump are very long-lived and quite toxic. And so the way that this, again, infrastructural work has created a systems change in what's possible for life on Earth. So our second analytic axis looks at those world-ripping consequences of certain kinds of infrastructural work. And our third this is the third analytic axis, we call it feral qualities. And feral qualities are the abilities of the non-humans themselves to, and these are non-humans that we don't have control over. So I'm not talking about our domestic animals, our technologies, but instead the non-humans that glom on to live with our industrial infrastructures, but do things that we didn't plan for them to do. And I've been using this term agilities, which I first learned from Donna Haraway's work with dogs, where it refers to a kind of training regime where you get your dog to jump over things and under tunnels. And but if you think about agilities, that's something that the dog, as well as the dog owner, has to learn. But if you think of that as historically gained abilities, then every kind of non-human gains historical abilities through different ways, through rapid evolution in some cases, through changing the nature of how it works. So the non-humans themselves get these agilities to be able to interact with the infrastructures and to go off in their own trajectories of doing something entirely different than what perhaps was the design of the infrastructural project itself. So, I mean, just back to carbon dioxide, that the people who design fossil fuel emitting engines aren't doing it because they want to produce carbon dioxide. At this point, it's a little bit hard to call it unintentional because obviously all of those manufacturers know perfectly well that they're producing all this carbon dioxide. However, you could still call it non-designed, that the carbon dioxide is working as a non-designed effect of a car or a factory that burns fossil fuels. But, if you think of, I'm sure, the use of antibiotics, for example, in livestock rearing, where it's just an ordinary part of commercial livestock rearing. And the non-designed effect is only the bacteria that are completely resistant to antibiotics manage to survive. So we are growing a crop of antibiotic-resistant bacteria through the commercial practices of livestock rearing. So that's another example of where the feral quality of the bacteria to figure out how to this, I mean, I think of it as a kind of superpower if you're interested in seeing it as in a science fiction kind of vein, but the bacteria has adapted to a situation where there's so much antibiotics around that it only survives if it has those qualities that allows it to ignore the antibiotics. So the feral quality of the antibiotic-resistant bacteria is its ability to thrive in this atmosphere that's saturated with antibiotics. So again, that's our third analytic axis, feral qualities. So it's Anthropocene detonators, tippers, and feral qualities. And through those three, we encourage readers of Feral Atlas to go back and forth across the field, the field reports, so that rather than separate things, we can ask questions about how they relate to each other. For example, other beings that have those superpowers, for example, plants that adapt to all the herbicides that are sprayed on them in commercial agriculture become these herbicide resistant plants. Well, we might want to think about those and the bacteria together. So these feral qualities allow us this horizontal way of going across the field reports. And the same with the detonators, where you might think about, well, what are all the things that have come in to this anthropogenic environment that we call the Anthropocene through the infrastructure of invasion? And, you know, we might include like all those introduced plants and animals, including all those that were so casually introduced as part of settler colonialism and have gone on to have really terrifying effects in many cases. So we can read horizontally across through these analytic axes, but I've gone on perhaps too long.
No, no, not at all. I wanted the audience to get a sense of how tremendous this research is and how dynamic it's not static at all. And that leads to this third question. The audience can really see how dynamic this research is. And it's going horizontally, vertically, diagonally, and just like a human organism. You see it spread its tendrils throughout the ecosystem and beyond to interacting with other entities. So the last question that I have is that the feral actors places an emphasis on cultural production, the arts as part of the digital structure. And the structure, as the feral activist describes itself, goes beyond the notion of maps. And it provides this experience that reminds me of a curated gallery space where someone is invited to come in and participate. And art often opens up these spaces for the viewers to imagine and think in ways that we typically don't on a daily basis, different ways of understanding and engaging with our environments. And so, how does the unique structure and the inclusion of art inform the Feral Atlas and how the readers and users will potentially interact with this content?
Thank you for that, because the Feral Atlas team put a lot of energy into thinking about uh, the the aesthetics of the Feral Atlas as well as the content. And so there's several levels to discuss this question. The first is perhaps the kinds of ethics of storytelling around us. That when I started the Feral Atlas, as you heard, I had just written a book about mushrooms, and the mushrooms stories are actually quite optimistic, considering that I talked about the ruins of capitalism. But here's a place where marginal people are making a living, and everybody loves these mushrooms. And I think some readers walked away with that in a more optimistic vein than I actually planned, to argue that everything is going to be okay and that as long as we have mushrooms, we don't need to worry about all the terrible things around us. And it made me, my challenge at that time was, okay, can we tell stories of the really dreadful, terrifying things that are happening? And I knew there'd been a lot of criticism about telling those terrifying stories, that they paralyze people, that far from allowing us to act, that we can just stop doing anything because it's so terrible. Well, I thought, okay, that's a challenge. The challenge for us is how can we tell those stories in a way that doesn't paralyze, but makes us really interested, curious, makes us want to know more instead of retreating away. So that was one of the challenges for the Feral Atlas, and part of why we have made it so enticing, that you start with Feral Atlas with these beautiful little watercolor pictures. When you look a little closer, you see there are things like styrofoam and coronavirus, but they're enticing pictures that are intended to draw people in and to be able to read the stories of the Atlas without seeing it as a blanket scare tactic that wouldn't allow you to go any further. So that's one set of the challenges. Another piece that was important was that we did want this to be an atlas, that is, to refer to places, but that we weren't satisfied with the ordinary kinds of maps. When we told people we wanted to make an atlas, everyone just assumed we were going to use GIS technologies and put everything on a common map. But the whole point is to refuse that and hang on to the concept of the map at the same time. That is, to bring the arts into map making. I started when the beginning of this to talk about the Patchy Anthropocene, the idea that the Anthropocene does not form a single planetary phenomenon, but needs to be studied in relation to its heterogeneity, into the making of particular patches. Well, that's why we need maps, is maps are the way that we can get to know these patches. But the patches are incompatible with each other, and that's what's interesting about them. That unlike a GIS map, the whole point of which is that the whole planet fits into a single grid, these patches don't fit together. And they come at incompatible scales. So we have maps in the atlas that are the side of a salmon from the perspective of a sea louse. So you don't see anything except the scales of the salmon. You know, try putting that on a GIS map. We have one of my favorite maps is by an Australian Aboriginal artist who has tried to depict his clan's relationship to the monitor lizards that are one of their sacred animals, and the cane toads, an invasive species that were brought as part of sugarcane plantations that are threatening the lives of the remaining monitor lizards. So that painting is a map because for him, it expresses ancestral relationships with land, and Australian Aborigines have used maps like that in land rights cases to try and argue for their occupation of this land. So it's a different kind of map, and one you cannot fit it on a GIS kind of grid. So we have many, many kinds of maps. We have a map of the extinction of bees in a particular valley in Colombia that shows one after the other kind of disappearing from the map. That we wanted to show the process in which commercial agriculture in that valley has not allowed these key pollinators to survive. So we have many kinds of maps, and you can see even from that opening how we had to stretch the concept of the map. We had to open it up and say diagrams might be maps, art pieces might be maps. We have an entry on American bullfrogs, which have been spread around the world as a commercial kind of livestock species, I guess you could call it, for an imagined meat industry that development organizations have been very hot on. And with it, the bullfrogs always escape because they're very athletic. And they also spread this very deadly disease that kills off frogs all around the world. So our map, the best thing we thought of a map was to show the kind of enclosure in which bullfrogs are commercially raised, and there's a frog jumping out of the enclosure. So that process that we tried to show is the map for us. So you see the arts and the mapping of the Patchy Anthropocene come together in these maps that we tried to create. Maybe one more comment on some of the other uses of art in the Feral Atlas. If you look at the atlas, we've also tried to explain the concept of Anthropocene detonators on the one hand and tippers on the other through visual materials. That the detonators are shown through these amazing landscapes that artist and architect Playful made together with various kinds of collaborators who've added inserts into these historical and fantastic landscapes that try and show you, I think more vividly than the essay could, what we mean by these Anthropocene detonators and the kinds of histories they represent, so that you can see both the Spanish ships arriving at the shore of North America, and see right next to it the Australian Aborigines fighting off the British conquest, that these things are combined in the same set of historical landscapes. So everything on them is based on some historical moment, but the juxtaposition, the collage, creates the effect of the detonator. With Tippers, we commissioned a series of very short videos. And the videos rarely have humans in them at all. They are attempts to show the huge effects of infrastructural work. So again, Tippers are those kinds of infrastructural work like long distance transport or the dumping of waste that won't go away. So we try and show the scope and just the impact of them by these minute-long videos through which we hope that viewers might they also have essays, incidentally, but we're hoping that the videos give you just a vivid sense of why something like long distance transport, for which, for example, we have a container ship being unloading, how this has made a big difference, that the kinds of transport that happened when we had other kinds of infrastructures of transport are just eclipsed by the new scale of this. So those little videos are meant to try and give you a very vivid sense of why this might be world ripping. Let me say just before I finish, though, I'm very proud of all the visual aspects of Feral Atlas, but there are essays that explore. So for those of you that like to wrangle with analytic and philosophical concepts, that want to think about histories, that we have a whole set of essays in there, so that this really is a book in the sense that there's reading that you can do to try and understand what we're doing, both by the Feral Atlas team trying to elaborate on just what we're trying to do, and also by invited writers, some of whom are quite distinguished folks. That Amitav Ghosh wrote for us on Empire, Sven Beckert on Capital. So we have some very interesting scholars who've contributed to the kind of meta-analysis about this feral effects of infrastructure that added together becomes the Anthropocene.
And it's done quite wonderfully. And I'm just going to, before we close, if you haven't already, we've closed this session, we'll open up for questions from the audience. If you haven't already visited the site, it's feralatlas.org. And when I use this word wonderful in relation to the Feral Atlas, my daughter, who's your student, introduced me to your work. And when she brought it, I saw that same sense of wonder when I used to take her to the tide pools or to the Science Museum or to the Natural History Museum. And it's really what the Feral Atlas encompasses. It sparks a curiosity and it feeds this need to want to know more, because it allows you to interact and to connect on so many levels where it doesn't overwhelm you, because it is the topics are quite frightening and can lead you down a very dark path very quickly, but it brings you back in to help situate you in, I live on this planet, I am part of the problem, and I am part of the solution. And with that, I'd like to open the questions first to the members of the Animal and Biodiversity Think Tank. So Yuriko, Marie, Eva, if you would like to start us off with the second part of our discussion.
Well, I'd like to echo Anisa's thanks and wonder at the work, which is just an extraordinary project. There's so many substantive questions that I would love to ask, but I think because this is a talk that you're doing for the Global Research Network on behalf of the community, this is a question that I think is perhaps preying on a lot of our minds, which is when we see a project like this, and we've all joined partly because we're interested in collaborative work. How on earth do you go about framing it to get funding?
Yes, that's a huge problem. I feel very lucky and privileged that I happened to get a grant from the Danish National Research Foundation. And let me say, when I had an interview um, with the grant makers for that grant, they said, well, you know, we grade our proposals like A, B, C, D, F, but then we have this other grade that we call P, which means potential. And we gave you a P. And, I mean, I feel very proud of that, but it also talks about how uh, it squeaks in the door rather than being something that's easily identifiable to a foundation before they decide to get a little bit brave and creative. So it isn't simple. However, I do think foundations are very much uh, looking for kinds of collaborative projects. And let me say, back to whether or not you can get funding, it is of great urgency, in my opinion, that humanists and natural scientists learn how to work together better than we do. And of course, there's been thousands of proposals of how to do that. But the one that we're pushing here, which is about this wonder and curiosity, that our common investment in knowing what's going on in the world through all the different ways we might know it, whether we're poets or statisticians, that that it's so urgent, given the kinds of challenges in front of us, that I can only say that we must keep trying to work on these things. I mean, you know, even the collaboration part, as much as every university and foundation says it's the most important thing, they do not make it easy. So they put millions of roadblocks in our way, and still it's urgent. And of course, the curiosity route takes much longer than the just everybody do their own little job kind of route. But all I can say is, in the end, it's more worthwhile. So it's up to us to keep pushing.
Thank you for the encouragement. Okay, we will keep pushing. Marina, Eva, did you have any questions? And if not, we should open up to the floor.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much, Dr. Tsing. It was extremely interesting to hear about this project. I was wondering about the Anthropocene, which is very central in the Feral Atlas, it seems. And it's often regarded a quite paradoxical concept because at the same time it emphasizes and it confirms human exceptionalism by confirming that humans are the species that influence the earth. So there's all those alternatives such as the Plantationocene and the Capitalocene and the Tulucene, which I cannot really pronounce. And I was wondering, is there a reason why the Feral Atlas is very much centered upon the Anthropocene and thereby by also upon the implicit divide between human and non-human worlds?
So we use the term Anthropocene in Feral Atlas because it's the kind of umbrella term for the conversation. So that's the reason to use it without necessarily signing on to all of the terrible implications that have been tied to that word. We also call the project the More Than Human Anthropocene. That's the subtitle of the project. So we're already trying to stretch it to argue that these effects that we, you know, have responsibility for as humans are also things that we're joined with, you know, not just things like carbon dioxide, but all kinds of critters, from pests and pathogens to, you know, toxins of various sorts, that we're joined by a host of non-humans in making this Anthropocene, which, for better or worse, we couldn't make by ourselves. That just as the conquest of the Americas by the Europeans, to the extent that it succeeded because of pathogens, of cows, of weeds, of all these things that came together to fight against Native Americans and the ecologies that they had helped to make possible. that this Anthropocene in all its terrors is a more than human phenomenon. As for all the other words, I embrace them too. I really think that it's fine to have all those other words from Capitalocene, Plantationocene, Holocene, and the whole bunch. I'm into all of them, but my way of doing it is to try and put that, draw that under this umbrella term, Anthropocene. Just as we're stretching the map, we're stretching the concept of the Anthropocene.
Okay, thank you very much. I see that there's already a question in the chat also by Bernie Holig. Maybe Bernie wants to ask this question. Is she here?
Hi, I just think I've had a really good look at the atlas, and I think it's wonderful for all the artistic reasons and the way you draw somebody into something that they probably would never look at, and you just go deeper and deeper and deeper, and then you come out and you explore another place. It's absolutely fantastic. But what inspired you? What was the thing that tipped you into broadening our view on the human impact? Because I think it's wonderful. I think you've done it so cleverly, and I absolutely love the approach. I wonder just how you honed in on it, and then how did it grow? Big question, I probably.
Well, there was a lot of serendipity in this. So I told you my own journey from the mushrooms to thinking I felt responsible to try and talk about some of the bad stuff that was happening. But that wasn't enough in itself for me to launch myself at a digital world that I had no experience in before. And that happened in steps. That originally this Feral Atlas project had its origin in just a little kind of lab page for this Aura project that I was directing. And everywhere I went, so we got this idea from the seminars that we were having in that project about the importance of feral effects. And everywhere I went, when I talked about it, people said, oh, I've got a project for you. Can I come and join in your atlas? So what was really a very small and rather humble project kind of snowballed without my thinking about it. And before I knew it, most of the contributors volunteered and said, I've got a story. It should be in your atlas. And if we had to turn it in last February, so a year ago now, because the publisher needed time to work with us on it. If we had left it open, it could be twice as big. I mean, they allowed a tiny gate. I said when we turned it in February, it was just the beginning. It was like maybe the 1st of March or right around now. And we said, well, maybe we should allow an entry on this coronavirus that seems to be a big deal right now. And at the time they said, no, that'll be dated. It's just going to be a little thing. So obviously Stanford University Press a year ago did not realize how big a deal this COVID thing was going to be. And it was almost June when they said, okay, we were wrong. We've got, you got to put something about COVID in here. But you only have a couple weeks. So get it together in like 2 weeks. And the problem was, we started asking people, and before you know it, we had like 10 coronavirus entries. So we've tried our very best to put in a bunch of coronavirus entries, all of which the authors, much to my real surprise, were willing to work like that to get them out so that we could slip them in before the production time was over. So it tells you something, I think, about how excited people were to be a part of this. And, in my dream world, a sister site would come up for the many kinds of stories that people have that we were unable to include in the virus before the gates slammed from the press.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I see there's another question by Elena. Elena, do you want to ask the question yourself?
I could. Hello. And thank you for this really brilliant presentation. I have to say, this is the first time that I hear you speak, although I've been reading your work for so long. So it's quite a bit of a privilege, actually. But I wanted to go back to the interdisciplinary. I did take a look at the website, and it's up. I mean, it's, for me, it is just something marvelous on so many different levels. But I do have to say again, the biggest obstacle in doing this kind of research and going back to the funding and all that is that the counter argument, even to such a wonderful project as yours, will be some kind of lack of rigor. And this is most often the response that one does get. And you got the P, but then if you get the more kind of elaborate response, it is usually, oh, but how could you possibly do this? You cannot do this. And even if the people involved are, let's say, an engineer, I don't know, a lawyer, an artist, and so on, they will just say, yes, but this just doesn't work because you're so different. And we are kind of, there's almost kind of like pride also in saying this, if I can add. I just, yeah.
Completely right. And let me say, that I had the privilege of starting this in Denmark, which is a small country where academics know each other across disciplines, and it was a big shock for me as an American that natural scientists were willing to talk to me, and that some of them have still hung in on these interdisciplinary projects that were started from the, we're in the arts division in their classification system, so that small worldness helped me to imagine it. But you're completely right; it's full of stumbling blocks, and I mainly think we have to keep trying, despite the fact of how hard it is. Despite the fact that how hard it is. I mean, one of the people who jumped in at the very last minute to write a really brilliant coronavirus story is the biologist Scott Gilbert, who's written about the holobiont, of which the coronavirus is one, and some other examples of what happens when part of the holobiont shifts to another species. So it's just a positive example, but truly it's a big struggle and not at all one. And even though we've been very careful here with citation trails and all of this kind of empirical research, the first attempt I got to try and reach out to a science journalist, and he said something like, well, I can't possibly vet this to see if it's correct. So, for him, without being in a peer-reviewed science journal, it opened the questions. So you're quite right. And then one other challenge that I'm embarrassed to say, having worked for 5 long years on this, I didn't know until after it was published. And I'm saying this to reach out to you all in the audience in case some of you happen to know someone, that it turns out that even though it's a book, because of its digital format, it's hard to get it reviewed. And it's going to break my heart if we never even get one written review. So if you know a book review editor, please let them know that they should stretch a little bit for a digital book that's worth reviewing it. And the reason this is relevant to that disciplinary thing is that my dream, which is that young scientists, social scientists, humanists, artists in the making could use this to set kinds of research agendas that hardly exist right now, that are in that overlap across disciplines. That in my dream, this project, a young scientist that's still trying to figure out what he or she wants to do might read this. But that's going to be impossible unless we can get reviewed. So you will be helping the project out a lot if you can figure out ways to bring it some of the kinds of scholarly legitimacy that we need to make it an influence on future imaginations. So thanks in advance for anything you can do.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Tsing, for this wonderful and insightful discussion.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you and allowing me to be part of what's clearly a very stimulating forum.